in 1999. Doomsayers cry, the log is the end. It's time for the Messiah to free us from sin. Spacecraft Satan overhead. Passengers littered with catacomb cells. Some say it's aliens that abduct humans. It's what tells me I could sing the truth in rhyme. Escape the burning crosses that plagued me my last lifetime. Not gonna be a martyr. Give it up or fall me behind. The executioner will get his hands on me and I won't resign. And I will resign.
There we go. Hello. And I always forget to do that when I'm actually on stage. It's terrible. Hello, everybody. I am Jayme CheeseSlice, the engineer producer for Uncontrolled Opposition. And we got a good show for you today. We're going to be talking about Hiroshima Nagasaki and how the people who reported on that or had participated on that were treated poorly for coming out publicly about their opposition to what the United States government did and with those atomic bomb drops. So if this is your first time you've ever joined the show before on the live stream, this is first and foremost a radio program. We've got to record it for WBAI, and we also go on the Pacific Radio Network, or sorry, the Progressive Radio Network. And we have to record it anyway, so we just decided to do it here live, and we're doing it on the Pasta to Go channel because thanks to Pasta, he's our executive producer. So we're going to record the show here for about an hour, and then I edit it to throw it up on the radio. But you get to see the full thing uncut right here, right now. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring on Gloria and Jeremy, our hosts of the Uncontrolled Opposition. How are you guys doing
Jayme.
today?
Nice haircut.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's long, long overdue. And we've got to start a timer, which I have right here. And I'm going to hand it over to Gloria, let her kick off the show, and hopefully it'll be smooth sailing, and then we'll be out of here in about an hour. All right. Take it away.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest. In this case, we don't have one. It's just Jeremy. The opinions you hear are ours, not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today, we're marking the 81st anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and telling the stories of two men who refused to let the human consequences of these attacks disappear behind the official narrative. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped Little Boy, a uranium bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, it dropped Fat Man, a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. The exact death toll will never be known. Many did not die from the initial blast. They died afterward from radiation exposures, burns, injuries, and radiation-related illnesses. By the end of 1945, estimates put the deaths at 140,000 in Hiroshima and 74,000 in Nagasaki, and the consequences of radiation continued for decades. But today's show is not simply about the bombs. It's about the people who questioned what had been done, what the world was being told about it, and now where do we stand today in respect to nuclear policy and the potential for nuclear war. Back to 1945, Major Claude Eatherly was an American pilot whose weather reconnaissance mission helped clear the skies for the Hiroshima attack. He did not fly the Enola Gay, but afterward he became deeply troubled by his connection to the bombing and expressed remorse. William Burchett was an Australian journalist who entered Hiroshima shortly after the bombing and reported on what he saw, including people who had survived the blast, but were dying from what became known as radiation sickness. His reporting challenged the official narrative and brought the reality of the atomic bomb's human consequences to an international audience. And they were not alone in questioning the morality or necessity of the bombing. Five-star General and President Dwight Eisenhower opposed using the atomic bomb for two reasons, saying he believed Japan was ready to surrender, so it was unnecessary, and that he was troubled by America becoming the first nation to use such a weapon. So why does this history matter now? Because the nuclear age did not end in 1945. For decades, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, rested on the terrifying premise that nuclear war could not be won because a nuclear attack would invite devastating retaliation. But today, we increasingly hear discussions about lower yield weapons, regional nuclear options, and the possibility of a supposedly limited nuclear conflict. Can a nuclear war really be limited? Can escalation actually be controlled? And what happens when the weapons become more usable precisely because they are described as smaller or more tactical? These are not abstract questions. The Trump administration's 2026 National Defense Strategy explicitly calls for maintaining a robust and modern nuclear deterrent. What makes the strategy more troubling is the expansion of circumstances under which the United States retains the option of using nuclear weapons first. The United States never adopted a no first use policy. It now includes extreme circumstances, such as significant non-nuclear strategic attacks on the U.S. or allied nuclear forces, command and control systems, early warning capabilities, or other attacks with potentially strategic consequences. This means the nuclear threshold is not simply they use a nuclear weapon or we respond with one. It can extend to conventional, biological, chemical, cyber, or other strategic attacks, creating greater ambiguity about when a conventional conflict could cross into nuclear use. Recent incidences underscore the danger. In Iran, the Bushehr 1 nuclear power plant was struck or threatened by projectiles. In Israel, Iranian missiles struck near the Dimona area and the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. The facilities were not destroyed and no nuclear exchange occurred, but they show how conventional warfare can come in direct conflict with nuclear infrastructure. These near misses involving nuclear fatalities in Iran and Israel illustrate how quickly a conventional conflict can enter the nuclear danger zone. That brings us back to Claude Eatherly and William Burchett. One was a participant who came to question his own role. The other was a journalist who witnessed the aftermath and refused to remain silent. Their stories force us to ask a question that is just as relevant today as it was in 1945. When governments tell us that nuclear weapons are necessary, controlled, or even potentially usable, who is willing to challenge that narrative? And what happens to those who do? Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov will take us through the extraordinary lives of Claude Eatherly and William Burchett, the controversies surrounding them, and the struggle over what the world was and is allowed to know about nuclear war. His articles are available on Covert Action Magazine's website and on his Substack. Thanks. Hey, Jeremy.
Thank you. Yeah, and it
Go
is Wilfred Burchett, not William Burchett.
Oh, thank you for the correction.
Yeah. So yeah, if you would like, I can start with him, and I mean, both are really very compelling historical figures, and I think, as you rightly point out, it's shameful the way that whistleblowers and truth tellers are treated throughout American history and throughout today. And also, in European, Burchett was Australian, and he was denied a passport in Australia and was viciously attacked in his homeland and all Western countries. And in fact, the attacks continued, because when I published my article, there were some people who wrote, comments below the article invoking the old charger that he was a Soviet apologist and agent. And I'm friendly with his son, George Burchett, and I think he actually, saw those comments below the article we were discussing. He's like, yeah, they come out of their burrows every time my dad's, comes up in a new article. You don't hear of these guys, and then they just come up to attack him. So, they're still carrying out a smear attack 80 years later. And Burchett had, well, I guess we'll start with him. He had many other, he had a brilliant career as a journalist. He started as a war correspondent with a fairly conventional attitude and outlook. I think he had a kind of colonial attitude living in Australia, and he covered the Pacific War theater. And even he said that he was covering like the bombing of Japan and the firebombing of Tokyo, which that killed 90,000. That, I think, set the record for most killed in one single night. The firebombing of Tokyo, 90 to 100,000 people. And, they deliberately used incendiaries so they would burn people's houses on fire, create fires across Tokyo. And people had to jump in the rivers to try and escape the fires, and they couldn't tread water for a long time. And a lot of people drowned. And Burchett covered that, but he said at that time he wasn't all that empathetic to the victims. He was still kind of covering it from the military point of view, which is how a lot of conventional war reporting has been. But he chained with Hiroshima, and then subsequently after that, he reported very critically, and from the so-called other side in the Korean and Vietnam wars, and he captured the perspective of the revolutionary movements in those countries, and he interviewed a lot of the people in North Korea and China, and he exposed abuses in the American prisoner of war camps, and debunked the narrative that the Chinese and North Korean were brainwashing and torturing American prisoners of war. And he also broke the story of germ warfare, which has now been corroborated, as we covered in the past show. He was the first to report that, and he was also attacked and ridiculed for that. And in Vietnam, he became something of a folk hero to the anti-war and New Left movement, because he wrote these books that conveyed the perspective of the revolutionary fighters in Vietnam, and that showed the horrendous human costs of U.S. military and covert operations, and the horrendous nature of the U.S. allies, which he showed in his books on Korea as well, with Syngman Rhee in South Korea, with a fascistic type leader, and Go Diem and Nguyen Cao Ki and Nguyen Van Thieu were fascistic leaders the CIA had helped install in South Vietnam, and he went into detail about how horrible they were and hated they were, because he was a good journalist. He got this, he interviewed the local people, captured their perspective and what they were saying. And so back to Hiroshima, and that changed thing, because he saw what, and he wrote about this quite thoughtfully in his 1983 book, which was written years later, In the Shadows of Hiroshima. And he said at the time he didn't quite understand that he was there as a reporter, the huge cover up that was going on, and that he was basically targeted in this cover up. Because what happened was that he was able to, there was very heavy censorship after the atomic bomb were dropped. No reporters were allowed in to Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and the military basically hand-selected their own propagandists, a guy named William Lawrence from the New York Times, to write a front-page cover story on the New York Times and a couple other stories in the Times conveying how they wanted it presented. And what Burchett says, I think correctly, is that in his 83 book, is that they wanted to convey the awesome power of the atomic bomb, because the real purpose was to scare the Soviets. There was no military necessity, and this was underscored by most of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that there was no military necessity to dropping the atomic bomb. Japan was already a defeated nation. In fact, Walter Trohan had reported in the Chicago Tribune that as early as January or February of 1945, the Japanese had issued terms for surrender. And the main demand was that the American occupying forces would retain the emperor as a symbolic figurehead, which is what the U.S. ultimately did. So they could have reached that deal in January or February 1945, when the atomic bomb attack occurred in August, months later. And 6 out of 7 Joint Chiefs of Staff said there was no military necessity. So we have to understand that, and that the real motive was to project American power and show the world, don't mess with the United States, and particularly the Soviet Union, that we rule the world now, we're the most powerful, and if you mess with us, look at the firepower we have at our disposal. So the reporting in the New York Times had to convey the power of the bomb, but to underplay the civilian casualties, and particularly also the after effects of the radiation. So William Lawrence reported that there were no major after effects from the radiation, and that the only casualties were those in the immediate vicinity of the bomb, who died right away. But Burchett, I think he took a train into Hiroshima, and he went. I think he was taken in by the Japanese police. But then some of the police wanted them to convey. They're like, you can convey the story of what the American did to our country. So they let him out of the police station, and I think they guided him a bit around, and they took him to some of the hospitals, and he interviewed patients and doctors. And this was a few weeks after, and he saw horrible sights in the hospitals, and he saw how so many people had this radiation sickness and were dying or were going to die, and that the doctors were reporting a lot of cancers. And when he talked to them, these were people not directly in where the bomb struck. They were a bit further away, but they were still getting the radiation sickness. So he reported on that, a story called The Atomic Plague in one of the London newspapers, and it countered the story of William Lawrence and what the military was trying to say. And so they barred him. After that, he was barred, and any other reporter was barred from visiting, because the U.S. established a military occupation of Japan from at the end of World War II to 1952. And they started smearing him and trying to discredit him. And he talked about how there was a briefing, like he attended after he did all these visits he attended a briefing by a Pentagon general who was selected by, who has worked under Leslie Groves, who had headed the Manhattan Project. And this, briefing, most of the other media reports were just based on this Pentagon briefing, and it was all lies. And they were saying again, like, the radiation is not bad, and there are no lingering after effects. And he got up and said, "I've been to the hospital, and what you're saying is BS." And they just kind of started insulting him and told him to shut up, basically. And I think, like, the guy even said, "Oh, it was a great way to die." Like, he was making like it was, trying to sugarcoat, basically. But that was, most of the media reporting in the United States was based on these Pentagon briefings. And he was really the only reporter who went on his own, interviewed doctors and patients. And then he went back years later in the 80s for his follow-up book, Shadows of Hiroshima, which I would recommend. And he also discusses the Eatherly case, which we'll get into. But yeah, he found it was even worse, that he interviewed doctors 30 years later, and he said in that book it was worse than he could have imagined, even in 1945, because the doctors were just telling him what they had seen over the years, and also that a lot of the offspring were impacted of the hibakusha. Many had serious health problems over years, cancers. If they were lucky enough to survive, there were just very, very high cancer rates and other diseases caused by the radiation sickness, and their offspring were affected. So 30 years later, when he's talking to doctors, they're telling him that.
Bring this up to date for just 1 second. When there was a tremendous amount of fear that the Biden administration was going to use nuclear weapons with Ukraine and Russia, New York City came out with a commercial, and it's called "You Got This." And it basically said, "Oh, if we have a nuclear war and it hits like New York, don't worry. Just close your windows and stay inside." So that mentality of radiation sickness and basically being incinerated is still being maintained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, as if the effects of nuclear war are not that bad. Trying to whitewash it.
You got this.
So, and this guy Lawrence, like in my article, you can contrast Burchett. This guy William Lawrence was like, because he had been invited by General Groves to witness the tests in the Manhattan Project, which were top secret, but he was allowed to report on it, I guess, after the bomb was dropped. And he wrote these these articles that were just like gushing at the awesome power of the bomb and the technology. It's just kind of like techno fetish. You see that with some weapon system today, where you might read in New York Times or other media, it's like glowing account of a new weapon system. And you can contrast that. And actually, Lawrence basically defended the decision. Like he said, he did an article on Nagasaki, and he said, "Does anyone feel any pity or compassion for the poor devils about to die?" Because he was an embedded journalist. He accompanied the bombers in Nagasaki. And then he asked that question. He says, "Not when one thinks of Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March." So he basically justifying it because of past Japanese atrocities. Although we've covered the Pearl Harbor incident on this show before, and my historical research made clear that was a provoked attack, and that the U.S. FDR administration could have prevented that. They wanted that to go forward because they wanted a pretext for war. Because don't forget, the Pacific War established the U.S. military base empire in the Asia Pacific, with all the bases the U.S. has now in Okinawa, South Korea, Japan. I mean, that was all enabled by the Pacific War, where the U.S. Became a Pacific power, replacing the Japanese. The U.S. couldn't tolerate a non-white empire. The Japanese prior to World War II, had established their own territorial empire in Southeast Asia to counter Western colonial empires, and that's something the U.S. couldn't tolerate. So they provoked the Pacific War, obliterated Japan, and established their own hegemony. And that's what we're seeing playing out today, with China has now become a challenger, and the U.S. is ramping up its base presence. And we could have another Pacific War on our hands in the future. So, but yeah, I mean, Burchett set a model as far as independent investigative journalism. And yeah, he was, attacked and pilloried. But I mean, his work stands out very well today. And yeah, we can compare a story with Claude Eatherly, if you like, who was also subjected to attack. If you want, I can go into that now.
Well, I just located the video, and I think we should just do a little clip of it if Jayme has it ready before we go into the other story. Let's see if he's got it up.
So there's been a nuclear attack. Don't ask me how or why, just know that the big one has hit, okay? So what do? There are 3 important steps that I want you to remember. Step 1, get inside fast. You, your friends, your family, get inside. And no, staying in the car is not an option. You need to get into a building and move away from the windows. Step 2, stay inside. Shut all doors and windows. Have a basement? Head there. If you don't have one, get as far into the middle of the building as possible. If you were outside after the blast, get clean immediately. Remove and bag all outer clothing to keep radioactive dust or ash away from your body. Step 3, stay tuned. Follow media for more information. Don't forget to sign up for Notify NYC for official alerts and updates. And don't go outside until officials say it's safe. All right, you've got this.
Thanks, Jayme. It's just, let's talk about this for just a second. I mean, this is, this is outrageous. This is a real PSA.
Well, the U.S. is doing everything to provoke another nuclear war. What they're doing with Ukraine, arming it with drones, and those drones are attacking inside Russia, attacking Russian energy facilities. They even, murdered a nuclear scientist in Russia. So, if the U.S. is going out of its way to try and provoke a war with nuclear armed powers and potential nuclear war, then you're going to invite a much greater risk. But, it seemed they want to reinvoke the climate of the Cold War. I mean, I think you remember, growing up in that era, they had all these, exercises where students had to go in shelters. It's a strategy of fear mongering.
In the 70s, we had some commercials. We had some pushback about nuclear war. There was a really good movie. I can't recall the name at this moment, but there was a very good movie that really, I think it even scared Reagan, President Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I interviewed the director, one of the producers, recently.
So that was the concept. But now, it's you got this. So basically, what they're doing is they're just trying to erode any pushback to this nuclear Armageddon that we really stand on the precipice of. So I just wanted to bring that up to date, that we are still lying and we're still hiding the work of journalists that have documented how dangerous nuclear war is. So we don't got this.
Well, yeah, it is worth reading Burchett today. You can find his article, The Atomic Plague, online, and his book Shadows of Hiroshima recalls, is about his trip to Hiroshima in the 1980s and the lingering after effects of what I was saying, the lingering after effects of the radiation, the offspring, and and he said it was much, much worse than even he could imagine. So yeah, this is something horrendous. And I mean, you have these generals talking very kind of openly about nuclear first strike or nuclear tip weapons, that it won't be so bad. And you have this foreign policy that's designed to, going out of its way to elevate the threat of nuclear war. And tearing up of the arms control treaties that were designed to regulate and limit nuclear weapons. These are all ominous developments, and we need more pushback. It gets to what we've been talking about on the show. I mean, it's good that there's opposition to the U.S. support for the Israeli genocide in Gaza, but this movement needs to become broader and oppose some of these phenomena we're describing here: the provocation of Russia, the new arms race, new nuclear arms race. We need to bring back those nuclear treaties, the arms control treaties that came about in the 1980s. That's something progressive movements should push for, something that's realistic, that could be achieved in the next 5 years, and push for a settlement of the Ukraine conflict, and stop threatening the Russians, and pursue diplomacy with the Russians. These are, I think, things progressives should be demanding. And I think we should all be conscious of that horrible history that we don't want to repeat. And it's also our country. It's not North Korea, it's not Russia that has used nuclear weapons. It's our country. And the change has to come here. And our country used it without any legitimate military basis, as 6 of the 7 Joint of Chiefs of Staff said. That's not my assessment. That's the assessment of the top military generals of that era. So,
Eisenhower.
Yeah, so we have to better understand the character of our country, and push for changes here, so the better nature of the United States can come out, and not this sadistic, Dr. Strangelove type elements who seem to often dominate the top levers of the U.S. government.
Maybe we could get that director on the show who did the film in the 70s, because that was a great one.
Yeah, it was in the early 80s. His name is Arthur Kanigas. He worked on that film. It had a major impact on the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s, which led to these arms control treaties that I think were important step in starting to reduce nuclear stockpiles. I mean, it's, I think, a good starting point, but we've gone backward with Biden and Trump tearing up those agreements.
Okay, let's go on to the next truth teller.
Okay, the story of Claude Eatherly is a very interesting one, worth reviewing. He was a Texan who served as a spotter on one of the spotter planes for the dropping of the Hiroshima atom bomb. And then when he came back, he developed deep remorse and misgiving. He would have nightmares about the children and people who were killed by the atom bomb. And then he was admitted to a mental asylum. Well, he started, I guess, engaging in what might be called nonconformist behavior. And he staged some crime, like he would rob a store, but he wouldn't actually steal any money. I think it was set up to get caught. And I think he wanted to punish himself. And psychiatrists testified at one of his trials that he was anguished by the dropping of the atomic bomb and his complicity in it, a deep psychological impact on him. And he was put in a mental facility in Waco, Texas, and he was subjected to electroshocks. And then he started more and more speaking out. He started corresponding with the Hibakusha survivors, writing them letters, offering to send them. I think he sent some financial support. And he got in touch with Bertrand Russell, who was a noted anti-nuclear and peace activist and philosopher. And a book was published of his letters with Bertrand Russell by a German author. And he became well known in peace movement circles and in the anti-nuclear movement that had developed in the 1950s in the aftermath of Hiroshima. And so he was kind of a symbol of that movement. And so the so-called deep state went into motion to attack him. My article goes in, I guess there were two facets. One was to keep him in this mental, there seems to be evidence, and that's something Wilfred Burchett wrote about in his 1983 book on Hiroshima, that there was an effort to blackmail his brother or pressure his brother not to sign the forms for his release from this mental facility. And apparently he may have been treated quite harshly there. And the other facet was what my article goes into. What I found that the FBI, there was a journalist named William Bradford Huey, who was a very well-known writer in the Cold War years. And actually, we can do another show about him in the Martin Luther King assassination, because as it turns out, he wrote a book promoting the myth that James Earl Ray was the assassin of Martin Luther King. And he actually was put in touch with Ray, and he may have pressured Ray into pleading guilty so it wouldn't go to a trial. And he was promised all the revenue from Huey's book on Ray that was going to be a bestseller, and that would pay all his legal fees and help his family. And they basically convinced Ray to plead guilty so it wouldn't go to trial, because a trial would show that they had a very poor case against Ray. The evidence against him was very poor. So Huey was connected with the deep state. He was one of these mockingbird journalists, and I go into it in the article. He had very close relation with J. Edgar Hoover. He was an editor of the American Mercury, which that was once a very well-known intellectual journal that published H.L. Mencken, who was one of the famous social critics in the 1920s. But it got bought over in the 1950s by a guy connected with the CIA, and Huey was appointed the editor, and it had all these CIA writers, because I reviewed, it was fun to read through those old issues of the 1950s, but I recognized the name. They were all CIA writers. William F. Buckley, who founded later the National Review and the Young Americans for Freedom, was a known CIA agent. This guy Hunter, who we discussed the germ warfare, he wrote this book creating this myth. He was known to have worked for the CIA psychological warfare branch, and he wrote a book that basically tried to show that the Chinese had brainwashed American prisoners of war, which was a CIA propaganda campaign to discredit the pilots who had testified that they had carried out germ warfare. This made it seem like they had been brainwashed by the Chinese, and so said that. So Hunter was writing for that magazine. This guy James Burnham, who crafted the rollback doctrine used by the CIA. So all these guys were working with Huey, and I read his articles, and he was promoting like all these positions the CIA would adopt in the Cold War, to support the war in Korea and to malign people like Alger Hiss, who was accused of being a Soviet spy, because he was supporting the Wallace policy of peace with the Russians, and the Yalta Agreement was a cooperative agreement between the U.S. and Soviet Union at the end of World War II, and Hiss was associated with that policy. So they were trying to smear him as a Soviet spy, and the Soviets, that position was associated with Soviet infiltration of the American government, the peace position. That's usually a dirty trick intelligence agencies use. So Huey was part of all that. And then he wrote this defamatory book about Eatherly to try and discredit him, since Eatherly was, again, a symbol of the peace and anti-nuclear movement of the 1950s and early 60s. Huey wrote a book, Hiroshima Pilot, defaming Eatherly, saying he was a con man and a fraud, that he really wasn't for peace, and that he was only bitter because the lead pilot got all the acclaim, and they made a movie about him. Do you remember his name? It's in the article. He became kind of like a celebrity, the lead pilot who dropped the bomb.
Oh, I don't remember his name. I could look it up.
It's in
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah,
the one who flew the no gay.
Yeah, Enola Gay.
Enola Gay.
Yeah. Anyway, so he
I did
contrasted him. Just to finish, he contrasted him with. He said Eatherly was jealous of this guy, and so then he made up this story that he he had developed a conscience, but really he was just bitter because he didn't get promoted in the military and he didn't become a celebrity. And then he had some troubles in his family life. And so he, wanted to cultivate the image as a peace guy, and it was just a fraud. Basically, that was the argument of Huey, and it was meant to defame Eatherly.
Well, I did a little bit of research on Eatherly, and one of the things that I thought was very important to mention here is that when he was committing these kind of guilt crimes to, I guess, be arrested, he was offered either he goes to a mental hospital or he goes to prison, and they convinced him to go to a mental hospital. So the first time he actually admitted himself to the mental hospital, and they did all kinds of horrific things with the electroshock. And that particular hospital wasn't just a conventional hospital. Maybe you could talk about that. This hospital was a special hospital, and conducted to the military. They did high level things, and this is really. And Jeremy and I had a conversation about this before the show last week. And, we were talking about how a lot of these techniques that were used in MK Ultra were being used before MK Ultra became popular. So, these techniques had a tendency to erase memory, to change behaviors, like the electroshock, lobotomies, all of these things were horrific. And then the CIA said, "Hey, these are good. Let's expand upon this, and let's invite these doctors to do more of it." So it is possible that they did some things to Eatherly to even discredit him and to destroy what remained of his sanity.
It seemed that there is a strong indication that he may have been subjected to some of that mind control experiments, and he would have been a good target of that because he was in a mental facility, because he had been in the Air Force, and because he was outspoken about and critical about U.S. policies and identified with the peace factions. He would have been a ripe target for that in that mental facility. And we know that, he was subjected to electroshock. So what kind of mind control experiments were done on him, we don't know. But, I mean, in general, the psychiatric profession was often very harsh and inhuman at that time. That's what fueled the growth of the anti-psychiatry movement. But it's very likely they would have singled him out, for special experiments or behavior control. He would have been a good person to mess with these behavior control program they were developing. And they usually did that on dissident. Like Frank Olson was a target before they assassinated him. He was a CIA scientist who had developed misgivings about the germ warfare program and its deployment in the Korean War. And he was subjected to behavior modification treatments and drugging before he was assassinated. So it appears very, very likely that Eatherly was a target of similar kind of operation, although we don't know all the details about it.
I also, when I went down this rabbit hole, I started looking up lobotomies, and there was actually the guy who invented the ice pick lobotomy. Did you ever go down that rabbit hole, Jeremy?
No, I don't know about that.
Well, they were just going around lobotomizing people left and right because they came up with a method where they could just insert an ice pick, basically above your eyeball into your brain, and then they drive it in with a hammer, literally the mallet, and then they would separate your frontal lobes. I mean, it was just horrific, and this was real. And this one particular guy who invented it would go around in a lobotomobile, literally, to different areas, and he would promise that, like, if your teenagers were unruly, he would do the teenagers too. I mean, crazy stuff goes on, folks. And, it's important to always use your own judgment and common sense. If something sounds terrible, or sounds miraculous, look into it. Don't just, sign up for it. And especially don't turn over your kids or,
No, I wouldn't trust any mental facility. I wouldn't, unless, knowing what has gone on in some of those facilities before. I wouldn't, if somebody's having some personal problems, don't go to a mental facility or have somebody admitted to a psychiatric facility, because chances are they'll come out much, much worse or, permanently ruined. And, I mean, there was all that stuff with the Ewan Cameron and the kind of experiments they were doing at McGill University, my alma mater. And, people came in like thought they were going to get some help because they had a divorce or, some personal
postpartum depression
problems.
is a big one.
But these are, solvable problems. I mean, they could benefit from somebody helping them, but instead they get, to help them get through it, but it's not life-threatening. And then you have these monsters, often the pay of the CIA, doing these experiments and sadistic stuff. And I mean, sure, it's improved from those days, but how much, I don't know. I wouldn't trust any of it, to be honest. The guy's name is Paul Tibbets. I looked it up. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting contrast. Like Tibbets, till his dying day, I think he lived till like 95 or maybe 100. And he gave speeches all around the U.S., always defending the bomb and thinking it was so great. And he said he lived very comfortably. And it's such a contrast with Eatherly, but also the way they were treated. It's kind of sad that, and given especially even what we now know, we know from Burchett and other writers about how, because a lot of what Burchett wrote was confirmed by other writers, like John Hershey interviewed a lot of victims. And he was a pretty mainstream writer in the New Yorker, and he wrote this book, Hiroshima, that got their story to why they're public. Then there was Robert J. Lifton, was an Army psychiatrist, and he wrote a study on the Hibakusha that shed light on the difficulty they were experiencing, both psychologically and physically. And it confirmed a lot of what Burchett had earlier reported. So I mean, Burchett's stuff was very well grounded, and a historian today, there have been some assessments by independent historian. They found that Burchett was on the mark, and that was accurate. Sadly, much of what he was reporting, versus this New York Times guy is now ridiculed. I mean, even the New York Times had an article about 4 or 5 years ago, since often the truth, they're willing to admit the truth, like 60, 70 years later. So the New York Times had some good articles about how Lawrence was this propagandist and promoted misinformation. They called him like Cheerleader Bill. He was a cheerleader for the Manhattan Project and the bomb, and he had close connection with the military. And so this, was admitted even in the New York Times, which had published Lawrence back then. So, and then that's a good learning experience, because today, when they're reporting on current events, it's often just propaganda for the military, and the dissidents are usually right if they're going out and getting the story and interviewing people like Burchett did, getting the true story, but they're subjected to censorship and ridicule. And you can compare, like the war in Ukraine, there have been Eva Bartlett and Patrick Lawrence are two reporters on the ground in eastern Ukraine. If you follow their Bartlett writes now on Substack, and she's done a lot of interview and story, and she experienced the bombing herself. She was on a bus because she lived there for a period in Donetsk, and the bus was bombed by the Ukrainian military, and she was at a hotel. Like, she narrowly survived some attacks. And she wrote about this and reported just the story of the people. And Patrick Lawrence was a former Navy veteran who married, I think, a Russian woman. And he took his camera around and was, posting these videos, which I would follow to get the real story. But they were blacklisted and censored in American media. And if they're ever mentioned, there's some smear against them, or like Vanessa Beeley did that with Syria. We had her on our show. But these are the real truth tellers. And years from now, probably they'll be recognized that they reported accurately, just like Wilfred Burchett and Hiroshima. So the more people are tuned to that, they'll look to these alternative voices and not go with the dominant attacks on them, because you find a lot of the left media are the worst in attacking and blacklisting people and say, oh, they're apologists for Russia or apologists for Assad, when they're trying to capture the voice of the Syrian people or Eastern Ukrainian people, as good reporters should. And that can help us better understand the conflict and why it's an injustice, and often why the U.S. can't win these wars, because they're opposing the will of the majority of the population, and you can't win a war that way. So I mean, it is very valuable in different ways to study that history and learn the lessons and adapt in the present. And hopefully these truth tellers and whistleblowers, if more people are there to support them, I think they would do better. People would stand up to these bullies.
I think it's important for people to understand, what's going on, and just to be educated. And that's what we try to do with our show. So, for example, we're told, and that Al Qaeda is bad. We're told Al Qaeda is terrible. Al Qaeda is a bunch of head choppers. Jeremy and I and many of our audience know, well, they were funded by the CIA and they were cultivated. So, we know these horrible things about them. And then all of a sudden they remove Assad and they put al-Jawlani, who is Al Qaeda, there. And then they try to sugarcoat it. And then they try to, destroy anyone who, says the emperor has no clothes, that this is Al Qaeda. So, we have to be aware and, see what's going on. Do you want to talk a little bit about al-Jawlani?
Okay, sure. Well, yeah, and I have an article I think we may be discussing in a few weeks on a National Endowment for Democracy. These professors are basically agents of the CIA teaching on American campuses. And I was reviewing the journal, and they're all praising al-Jawlani. They attack Assad. And yet you can read in the New York Times today, because I read the New York Times every morning, and there's an article about how al-Jawlani is attacking the Druze in Syria. He's going after minority groups, but these pseudo-academics are not talking about that at all. And there was a good book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman called Worthy and Unworthy Victims, and they emphasize how the media and academics, spotlight the victims of enemies of the United States, because it serves an ideological agenda. So the Uyghurs, or if Russia committed a crime in the Ukraine war, that's publicized ad nauseum. The media and academics are the same. They just follow suit. And a lot of them are actually tied with intelligence agencies, it turns out. But the, unworthy victim are people like in Eastern Ukraine, who Eva Bartlett was covering their story, or the Druze. I mean, periodically you do get a report. Of course, the New York Times didn't discuss how the U.S. had helped empower al-Jawlani. They didn't give the backstory and how much weapons the U.S. may be giving this government and the Israeli rule. But at least periodically you do get some grounded reporting in the New York Times. And if you know the bigger picture, you can put two and two together. But those are generally the unworthy victim. You hear very little of the victims of U.S. client regimes. So the Ukrainian government, like the Eastern Ukraine, have been battered and attacked since 2014, since the fascist coup backed by the CIA. And Bartlett had an article that at least 10,000 civilians have been killed. And there's no attention at all. Even in the alternative media, has been silent. Those are the unworthy victims. And they include people like a young ballerina was killed by a Ukrainian missile strike coming from ballerina practice. And their coach, who's a famous ballerina coach and I think Olympian, and the two were murdered. Or these girls in a dormitory who were murdered by a Ukrainian drone strike. Or this nuclear scientist. So those victims, or there's a guy, Bogdan Sirodiak, you only can learn about him on the World Socialist website. He has socialist views and he advocates for peace between Ukraine and Russia. He just got a 15-year prison sentence by the Ukrainian government. but you're not going to read about that in the New York Times. It's not going to be taught to students. Only Russia is bad. So it's very biased narratives that we get, and it's just, worthy versus unworthy victims. So I think that is still a useful book. It was written in the 1970s by Chomsky and Herman. So that paradigm, I think, unfortunately prevails, and that's why we're uncontrolled opposition. A lot of the alternative media, pseudo-alternative, is really controlled opposition. But as uncontrolled opposition who are free and independent, we want to spotlight the unworthy victim because they're deserving of our sympathy. And it's often our government that's the one we can actually do something. That's one thing that Chomsky and Herman pointed out, is that we have the most power in our own country to try and rein in our government. If the U.S. government or Canadian government is supplying arms to Ukraine that's killing innocent people, we do have the power to marshal together activist movements to try and halt those arms supplies, where we can't alter what foreign governments are doing. So if we're living here in the United States, we do have some ability, if we can develop consciousness of people and movements and try and start pressuring elected representatives to cut off the arms supply. So we can actually do something. So in the media, it is important to spotlight the victims of U.S. government. They're either direct victims or proxy regimes.
Yeah, and also students and universities can also protest military operations that go on in their schools.
And we see they're having an impact with the Israeli Gaza. Look, you have the shifts in the Democratic Party. Those protests are making a difference. And the whole discourse on the Israel-Palestine is shifting. These candidates are coming up who are now saying how much they're against Israel, and they're actually winning primaries. And that points to what we're saying. This movement on the campuses needs to broaden its horizon and focus on a world level and look to other conflicts where the U.S. is playing a very negative role, like Ukraine, Russia, like Syria, like in Latin America, and push for an end to U.S. support to those horrendous governments and the wars that the U.S. is either directly or indirectly triggering or provoking.
And while we're at it, since we are uncontrolled opposition, we're not funded by the Dems, and we're not funded by the Republicans, and we're not funded by the Green Party, and we're not funded by anybody except you, our dear listeners. So please help us out and share our broadcast. Forward our videos and our podcasts to your friends and family, and contribute. We can accept donations on Jeremy's Substack and on Uncontrolled Opposition Substack. So please join us and help, because we don't have. If you're uncontrolled opposition, there's nobody that is propping you up except listeners. So I just wanted to make that little pitch. I think we're kind of running out of time here, so I'd like to just give Jeremy the opportunity to tell us where we can follow your work.
Okay, well, you can follow my work at Covert Action Magazine or on my website, jeremykuzmarov.com, and Too Hot for the Mainstream is a Substack. I have a new book called On Political Assassinations I think we'll be discussing. And my books are promoted on my website, jeremykuzmarov.com. So you can go there. And I published 8 books. And the most recent ones deal with political assassination. Also in Syria, I published a book last year with Dan Kovalek, who's the lawyer for the Shiite Alawite community and has traveled extensively in Syria. So that book, Syria Anatomy of Regime Change, was published last year. And it's the only comprehensive account of a 40-year regime change operation of the U.S. in Syria. And I wrote the chapter called The Intellectuals, related to what we're saying today, called The Intellectuals Played Their Part, looks at the role that often left largely is a focus on left-wing intellectuals and how they supported this regime change operation by promoting these dominant narratives and by slandering. That relates to what we're saying today, how whistleblowers and truth tellers are slandered, and the left sometimes is no better than the right. And that's what I showed with Syria. It was often these left-wing outlets that we can't mention, the writers or journalists were the one attacking, like the few principal anti-imperialists like Max Blumenthal was attacked as an Assad stooge, or Vanessa Beeley, and they were just demonizing the Assad government and supporting regime change operations. So we have to be wary of that, and also that the intelligence agencies historically have often infiltrated the left. They want to skew because they know that the left is where opposition to U.S. wars have often come historically. So they want to co-opt the left and prevent a genuine opposition movement. And that's why they push these kind of regime change narratives. You find that a lot in left-wing media outlets, and that is a sign of infiltration. And that's one reason we developed this show. So it is something people should be more attuned to, and we can fight back against that.
Well, the other thing I just want to mention real quickly is Jeremy's book that just came out on assassinations. We are going to be discussing on our next episode, so please join us next week to hear that. And in closing, the opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional, medical, or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions and consult their own doctors. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thank you, guys. I think that'll.
It's fun once in a while to just, have me and Jeremy. It really is. Although I love our guests. I do love our guests, but it was nice.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
what movies do you think they were that were the ones you're thinking of? Because I've got a short list trying to figure it out. Like, there was like A Boy and His Dog. Was that one you were thinking of?
I'd have to look it up. I forget the name, but there was a movie that I think played out a nuclear attack and how horrible it would be, and that scared a lot of people. And it helped generate the nuclear freeze movement of the 80s, which was a huge movement.
Yeah.
That ultimately led to arms. That's why these movements do have an impact, and it led even the Reagan administration was kind of neocon dominated administration, but they moved towards supporting arms control treaties like the INF treaty that lasted for years and was a good start, to establishing better U.S.-Russia relations and, controlling the spread of nuclear weapons and limiting the numbers.
Yeah.
So,
Jayme, I just sent you something you could play. It's a very short commercial, but I recall this one, and I think it's effective. And I think it will work for.
Well, it's just a video. It's just an image.
No, I didn't send you the link.
No, you just sent me an image.
Ah, crap.
Well, while you're finding that, there's a lot of movies though that talk about the situation. The famous one is Dr. Strangelove, of course, but there's also Colossus, the Forbidden Project, which has to do with AI and nuclear weapons, as well as War Games from the 1980s, which I think, while I don't think it's a super great movie, it was a very effective movie in conveying the message, and it was popular, very popular, which reached a lot of people and scaring them about the threats of nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union.
Okay, I sent it. Let's end on this video. It's really powerful.
There's also The Day After. I just wanted to mention The Day After.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Let me look this up.
The Day After might be the one that Reagan was.
That may be the one, that I was referring to, yeah.
And also, I have one clip I wanted to show too to go back to your PSA, but let's go ahead and bring this.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
I don't know if it says what year it was, but I think it's the 70s or maybe the early 80s. I'm not sure.
It might in the description. I'll try to look it up. Here we go.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark, we must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
That's from 1964.
I remember that. I
Yeah.
remember that. Johnson. Ah.
But we did have some very effective anti-nuclear weapon propaganda. I mean, it
Not
is
propaganda. This is true.
It's
This
public
is what
service
it
announcement.
really
But
does.
I mean, but it was good at propagandizing the population into being against nuclear warfare and nuclear weapons. And we had Ted Postal on back in February, and
Yeah.
I asked him about the Terminator 2 scene where they show the nuclear blast. And I've got the clip here.
Okay.
I've muted the audio so
Go ahead.
we can just
Yeah.
show the clip. But so we'll talk over it.
Oh yeah, this is a good one.
This is Sarah Connor having her dream sequence about
Yeah, this is
the
good.
day
With this
wave coming through, which shatters everything behind it. It's just absurd. But he said that was the first time Hollywood got it right when showing one of these destructive things, and that's what it was. So in the context of that, like Sarah Connor falls asleep and then she dreams about what's going to happen in the future if they don't get things done, and then she wakes up because of how horrifying that dream is. But she also shows us in that movie what we're supposed to be doing about data centers. So if you want to know, go check out the movie, because I don't think we can talk about it. But she got it right. Anyway, that's all I had. You guys have anything
Yeah,
else?
no, I think we're good. I think we should end on that high note. That was fantastic video.
Yeah. High note of nuclear destruction. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Well,
But
the thing
we
is,
don't have
wake
stuff
up,
like
folks.
that anymore that's
Wake up,
popular,
folks.
that's in everybody's face and everybody's mind. We haven't had that in like probably 10, 15 years. And somebody should probably make something that just shows us, reminds us how horrible this is. And
Well, I'm sure
just-
people are making it.
forgot.
It doesn't see daylight. You know,
Yeah.
the same way we're shadow banned and and strangled financially. So are these directors and producers who are working on films that actually tell the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think that's it for the day, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you to everybody for watching the show, and thanks to Craig Pasta Jardula for providing us resources we need to do the show and being executive producer. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Jeremy, for being here. Another good show. We'll have this out for the radio next week on, I believe, Tuesday, and keep watching us. We're going to be doing more of these shows, so it's a lot of fun, and I think we do some really important work to get out there. So share it to everybody, because YouTube doesn't want to. So, well, have a good weekend, everybody. We'll see you next time.